I was raised on a ranch, grew up in Powell Butte, Oregon. I started riding when I was probably 2 years old by myself. And since then, it's just progressed pretty rapidly from there. I started rodeoing when I was probably 5 or 6 years old and haven't quit yet. When I was a little itty bitty kid, I kind of set my mind to the fact that anything I wanted to do horseback, I've done it and I can do it. And I'll do it till I get it right. My folks, it didn't matter to them that they had daughters and that they didn't have boys, because we did all the same work. I could do anything. I drove tractor, gathered cattle, loaded trucks, anything. Anything that my dad did, I did, and my sisters as well.
They're living on these ranches, they are working with their fathers, they handle the horses, and why can't they compete? And they see themselves on the ranches doing just as much as the men. Why can't they do that in the rodeo as well?
And so these girls were riding astride, and that was very, very, the proper ladies didn't think much of that. And that alone, the fact that these women were riding astride and were wearing clothes that were a little different, was really a mark of a cowgirl. And any girl that would get herself into that garb was beyond the pale. The proper ladies didn't approve.
It was a warm July morning in the summer of 1904 when 21-year-old Bertha Kaepernick boarded the train in Sterling, Colorado for the 8th annual Cheyenne Frontier Days Rodeo. Ever since she was a child growing up on the plains of eastern Colorado, Bertha had heard the distant whistle of the Burlington train as it began the early morning milk run. The whistle would echo through the rolling farmland and pastures that made up the Platte River Valley as the train made its way from Sterling, past her parents' farm, to Cheyenne, Wyoming, 100 miles to the north. In 1870, Bertha's parents, Wilhelm and Frederica, had emigrated from Germany to Cleveland, Ohio, with their sons Frank and William. In Cleveland, Frederica gave birth to 2 daughters, Minnie in 1880 and Bertha in 1883. By Bertha's 3rd birthday in 1886, her parents had moved to Atwood, Colorado, joining a number of other German immigrant families who traveled west to try their hands at farming near the Platte River. The family chose to homestead 160 acres near the new town site of Atwood, just over the rolling hills that block the view of the river valley. Bertha grew up in the wide open West, and though she was not aware of it, she was offered experiences and opportunities far beyond those her childhood friends enjoyed back east in Cleveland. Among her first, riding a horse and working with her father and brothers.
Well, there is a story that her father put her on a horse when she was 3 years old, and they were bringing cattle in and she had to watch a gate. And he told her not to get off the horse because there was no way she could get back on.
Bertha later wrote that her father eventually took all the docile horses away to prevent his little 7-year-old from riding them. She instead switched to riding the family's young dairy calves, and later took to catching and riding wild colts from nearby ranches.
Her and her brothers would buck out the calves when their parents would go to town. They would corner them in the corral and buck the calves out, but that wasn't enough bucking for her. She'd like to ride the bucking horses.
Over the years, she developed quite a local reputation for her ability to ride a bucking horse.
I really don't remember when I began to ride bad horses. I had a pony and a saddle when I was a tiny girl, but that sort of riding didn't suit me. I saw the bronco busters at work taming the horses right off the range. I was a strong girl, and I knew that I could ride as well as any of the men, so it wasn't long until I began to bust broncos. I had to ride in secret, of course, but I tackled some pretty bad ones and subdued them, and then I went right into the corral one day when the men were at work breaking horses, and I showed them what I could do. After that, it came easy. Somebody heard of my ability to ride buckers and offered me an engagement at the Colorado Fair. I took part in a bucking contest and rode a couple of outlaws, and since then I've been doing that sort of riding right along.
From its inception in 1897, the Cheyenne Frontier Days Rodeo has drawn contestants from hundreds of miles around, all converging on the capital of Wyoming for a chance of winning prize money and a year of bragging rights. Bertha went to Cheyenne in 1904 with the intention of competing in the very popular ladies' cow pony race. But she also had her eye on the Union Pacific prize of a custom saddle, bridle, and spurs valued at $250. The award, which had been advertised weekly in her local newspaper, was given only to the winner of the bucking horse competition. When Bertha's train arrived at Cheyenne's Union Station that Monday afternoon in 1904, the town of 20,000 had swelled to almost 50,000, with more people arriving on every train.
Tonight, the streets are filled with a monster crowd of people who are making the night air hideous with the blowing of horns and the screeching of other nerve-wracking instruments. Strains of band music mingle strangely with the awful din, and above all can be heard the ki-yi of Indians and the merry whoop of the cowboy, all going to make up a scene that is seldom witnessed, even in the noisy West. Hugo, Colorado Range Herald, September 1st, 1904.
And to get to town and see all this going on, oh my, they had a grand time. And that was what people came for. One old cowboy said, "Why, I just come to Cheyenne just to hear the band play, because I never heard band music the rest of the year." A Sousa band concert, oh my.
On the afternoon of Wednesday, August 31st, 1904, more than 6,000 people filled Cheyenne's Frontier Park grandstands and enjoyed the music of the Army's Fort Russell 11th Infantry Band. Around noon, a bank of black clouds appeared from the west. An hour later, the rain began to fall. Within minutes, light showers grew to a downpour. The Wyoming Tribune reported, "The rain and mud added the necessary touch of realism to the scenes to make them perfect." Here was life on the plains in the roundup camps, where the feats of daring and valor are performed and reenacted in all kinds of weather. An announcer came to the middle of the arena with a large megaphone and introduced Bill Pickett, the famous black cowboy who had earned his reputation as the first man to ever jump from a galloping horse onto the back of a running steer and wrestle the animal to the ground by biting the steer's lip. Despite the muddy infield, Pickett wowed the crowd with his skills. After the infield had been cleared of the steer ropers, the announcer introduced a young woman walking out to the rodeo arena. The Wyoming Tribune's front page reported that the rodeo committee had sprung a pleasing surprise upon the crowds by introducing Miss Bertha Kaepernick, the first competitor in the bucking horse competition. Just 2 years earlier, the rodeo committee had refused to let two cowgirls compete in the bucking horse event. However, times had changed, and in 1904, Bertha Kaepernick was competing in the bucking horse competition at the Cheyenne Frontier Days Rodeo, the first woman to ever do so. Bertha settled into the saddle and gave the signal to turn the animal loose. The Wyoming Tribune described what happened next.
In the twinkling, the animal was a mass of tingling nerves and animated muscles. Every trick known to the most cunning of all brutes was adopted by the horse to unseat the little swaying form upon its back. It leaped high into the air, came down solidly on 4 feet, reared, plunged, sidestepped, twisted, turned, whirled, and put into effect all of the devices that could creep into its wily head in a desperate attempt to get rid of that strange thing on its back, but all to no purpose. It was one of the most remarkable exhibitions of rough riding ever seen here, and would have been exciting had the rider been a man. As it was, the great magnitude cheered to the echo this extraordinary lady who has conquered the West. The Wyoming Tribune, August 31st, 1904.
"1883 was a watershed year for the West. It was in this year that newspapers started printing stories about cowgirls, women who could rope and ride, just like the cowboys in the dime novels of the day. And it was the year that Bertha Kaepernick was born. By 1883, the American Plains Indians had lost their struggle to remain free. Millions of the bison that their lives depended upon had been wantonly slaughtered, and railroads linked the continent east to west and north to south. In 1883, Theodore Roosevelt came to the Badlands in the Dakota Territory to shoot a buffalo before they all disappeared. Before he left, he purchased the Chimney Butte Ranch so that he too could be part of the cattle boom on the Great Plains. And William F. Cody, a former U.S. Army scout and buffalo hunter for the Kansas Pacific Railroad, took his Buffalo Bills Wild West show on tour to New York City after the success of his 1882 4th of July celebration in North Platte, Nebraska. When Bertha Kaepernick made her historic bronc ride at Cheyenne Frontier Days, she was the first cowgirl to ride the wave of women entering the new sport of rodeo. For this to happen, a series of events all fell into perfect alignment. Bertha's bronc riding display before the crowds at Frontier Days could not have occurred even a year earlier or 25 years later. It was not permitted. These pioneering women grew up in a different environment, following the bitter winter of 1886 and the demise of the large free-grazing cattle operations. In the years following the Great Die-Up, as the winter of 1886 came to be known, smaller family ranches that combined farming and ranching replaced the large free-range cattle operations. It was on these homesteads that, for the first time in generations, daughters found themselves spending time and working side by side with their fathers and brothers. A way of life entirely different than that of young women in the cities of the East and even the Far West. Although largely unaware of their freedoms, these girls grew up unencumbered by the customs that restricted the lives of other girls. Out on the plains, they could be almost anything that they dreamed.
You were allowed to be strong. You were allowed to be independent on a horse. Most other venues were women's work or men's work, but the horse was the one place where you were just out there and you were free.
A number of these ranch and farm girls would go on to challenge and change the conventional perception of women in athletic competition. They were the Rodeo Cowgirls, women who competed alongside men in the new world of competitive ranch work and cowboy games. Over the years, the Rodeo Cowgirls made quite an impression on the American public as they rode the wave of women's equality and freedom during the Progressive Era. At their peak in the 1920s, more than 260 cowgirls were traveling the country competing in rodeos. Their wild ride, however, was relatively short-lived. It lasted just under 30 years. By the time they'd reached their zenith in the early 1920s, powerful social and economic forces that would eventually overtake the cowgirls had already begun.
Some other scholars had said, well, it was when Bonnie McCarroll was killed in Pendleton that really signaled the end of women competing. But if you look at the press, you see that tide turned a number of years earlier. And with Bonnie McCarroll, it was sort of, that was the excuse they needed to say no more.
The way things fell, and of course, like I said, Bonnie was just so famous that they were able to use that to their advantage to get rid of an event. Anytime you cut out a woman's event, you got room for another men's event and more money for the cowboy.
In marked contrast to the rural West, Eastern culture was stifling to women growing up in the late Victorian age. Women's reform movements were considered a radical undertaking, for they could upset the very foundations of Eastern culture and class structure. The very thought of women shedding their cumbersome clothing in exchange for a pair of pants was enough for the New York Times to denounce the dress reform movement in 1876.
It is time that they should carefully investigate that curious disease peculiar to women, which is vulgarly called dress reform, and which is characterized by an abnormal and unconquerable thirst for trousers.
The harsh criticism of women's dress reform was in response to the New Women's Pavilion at the 1876 Centennial Exhibit in Philadelphia, where women's accomplishments and their efforts to enter the male-dominated workplace were on display. With women enjoying equal rights in Wyoming since 1869, there was serious concern that assertive Western women would spread the voting rights movement to other states and upset the established traditions of the East.
The disease uniformly fastens upon women of exceptional muscular strength and upon those of extraordinary conversational powers. So well established is this fact, especially among the people of our Western states, that when a woman displays unusual vigor in wielding stove lids, or in otherwise convincing her husband of his faults, her acquaintances immediately recognize her as one who may be expected to clamor for trousers. The New York Times, May 27, 1876.
How had these thoughts come about? In short, it was the Industrial Revolution. The changes that it brought to the nature of family and work would cause repercussions that are still felt even today. The Industrial Revolution simply changed how people worked. Rather than family-oriented manufacturing and small farms, during the Industrial Revolution, it was primarily the husband who left home to go and work in a factory or office, leaving his wife to care for the home and children. Over time, home and work became two distinct places.
Men had traditionally been in charge of the household, in charge of the education and religious upbringing of children. Over time, as we get toward the market economy and then into industrialization, they're pulled further and further away.
In the rural American West, life was quite different. Economic success, as before the Industrial Revolution, was a family affair. For the first time in generations, daughters were spending time and working with their fathers and brothers. As a result, the girls became far more assertive and independent than their mother's generation.
In the West, there was a lot of work to be done, and everybody had to do it. These children were not raised in that way. They were exposed to a free environment where they would go out and gather the cattle, where they would go out and check the fences, where they would take upon themselves the independence of work projects that rendered them different individuals than their counterparts in the East and a more structured society.
Mothers tried their best to raise their daughters as they themselves had been raised, but without the host of female influences found in an urban setting, these girls were freer to experiment with male and female gender roles. It was the environment of the West that allowed young girls to develop the skills to be called cowgirls and eventually become popular fixtures on the professional rodeo circuit.
The East has very distinct set ideas of what a woman should be, and any deviation from that is radical. In the West, it becomes necessary. And so it's not radical, it's getting things done and making it work and still remaining women.
The Texas cattle herder is a character the like of which can be found nowhere else on earth. Of course, he is unlearned and illiterate, with few wants and meager ambition. His diet is principally Navy plug and whiskey, and the occupation dearest to his heart is gambling. He generally wears a revolver on each side of his person, which he will use with as little hesitation on a man as on a wild animal. The Topeka Commonwealth, August 15, 1871. Morally, as a class, they are foul-mouthed, blasphemous, drunken, lecherous, and utterly corrupt. Usually harmless on the plains when sober, they are dreaded in towns, for then liquor has the ascendancy over them. The Cheyenne Daily Leader, October 3, 1882.
The cowboy was simply a stock herder in the first two-thirds of the 19th century. They were called cowboys because they worked with cows. If they worked with pigs, they were pig boys.
The first cowboys were all well-armed Confederate Civil War veterans who had been exposed to violence for a number of years. Some luckless miners, assorted drifters, and outlaws. The golden age of the true American cowboy began in 1867, when Texas cattle ranchers had to move to market more than 1 million surplus cattle that had accumulated during the Civil War. Before the war, ranchers would drive their small herds to the railroads in St. Louis and Kansas City. After the war, the railheads of the Transcontinental Railroad system had reached western Kansas. Now, to move the huge volume of cattle to market, the ranchers would simply head due north until they reached the railroad. Navigating the wide-open plains was as easy as pointing their wagons every evening to the North Star. This was the birth of the large cattle drives and the birth of the American cowboy. In the 1870s, cattlemen and investors capitalized on the opportunities of raising cattle on the northern ranges, west of the Missouri River. For the next 15 years, thousands of cattle were driven from Texas and allowed to free graze on the open public grasslands of the West. To become an entrepreneurial cattle baron took little more skill than buying a herd of cattle. When they were fattened, the cattle were moved to market with the help of itinerant cowboys. Then, the profits rolled in. This beef bonanza, as it came to be known, was rightly regarded as easy money. By 1886, more than 7.5 million cattle were competing for now overgrazed land in Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, western Nebraska, and western Kansas. While cattle owners realized that growing hay for winter feed was prudent business practice, they considered it cheaper to risk a few percent of the herd in winter than incur the added costs. These cattle barons, like feudal landowners, maintained control over large areas of public land that had been set aside for homesteading. By locking up key sources of water, stringing fences, joining forces through stockmen's associations, and intimidating small farmers, these cattle barons tried to hold back the flow of homesteaders. Overgrazing the range continued. Where one steer could once be supported by 20 acres of new range, by 1885, it required 40 acres of range to maintain a single steer. Then, the inevitable happened. The winter of 1886 started early when the first heavy snows began to fall in October. The snow became so deep that the cattle could not reach the sparse grass beneath it. In January, warm Chinook winds melted the snow and flooded the plains. Then the brutal winter returned, covering the grasslands in an impenetrable layer of ice and a new layer of deep snow. As the temperatures plummeted to 40 and 50 degrees below zero, cattle died by the thousands. When the snow and ice finally melted, the losses were devastating. There were dead animals everywhere. In some areas, the losses were only 25%. In other areas, almost 90% of the cattle were dead. No one escaped the wrath of that winter. A concerned Teddy Roosevelt returned to his North Dakota ranch in the spring after his honeymoon in Europe and witnessed the aftermath.
The losses are crippling. For the first time, I have been utterly unable to enjoy a visit to my ranch. I shall be glad to get home. In its present form, stock raising on the plains is doomed and can hardly outlast the century.
Eventually, the weather returned to normal, but it was too late. The great die-up had taken its toll. Most of the cattle barons were ruined, and the cowboys were out of work. The winter of 1886 and 87 changed the business of ranching, and with it, the role of the cowboy. Ranching after that disastrous winter required farming many acres of hay to be stored for winter. It was the sensible way to ensure that the cattle had enough feed throughout the unpredictable winters. Ranching and farming were now combined. With the breakup of the large cattle operations, smaller family ranches moved in to fill the void. The cowboy changed from a seasonal laborer who tended cattle on horseback into a ranch hand that worked year-round and mostly upon foot.
The upshot was that the big open range finally came to an end. It became more economical to fence and to ranch, and to ranch scientifically, than to ranch on the huge open range. When that happened, the old open range cowboy finally came to an end.
Americans have always been fascinated with the frontier West. By going west, one could develop a new life and seek new opportunities. But by 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau had announced that the open frontier of the United States no longer existed, and they would no longer track westward migration. What was once thought of as a boundless land of opportunity had come to a close. Americans had officially settled the West. Although Americans continued to move westward, seeking new opportunities, by 1890, the typical Westerner lived in a town, not on a homestead. Two men truly understood the transformations that had taken place in the United States and what our frontier past meant to our national identity. During the summer of the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner, a young historian, read his academic research paper, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, to the American Historical Association in Chicago. That same evening, Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Congress of the Rough Riders of the World performed within sight of the Great Chicago Fair. Through careful academic research, Turner had concluded that by 1890, the American frontier was gone. He also reasoned that the myth of the American frontier, with its almost limitless free land, was an integral part of our culture. Buffalo Bill, on the other hand, knew instinctively that the notion of the American frontier, with its cowboys, Indians, and stagecoach holdups, was a popular attraction and a moneymaker.
There is something about the arena and the thunder of hooves and the power of horses and the smell of gunpowder that's exciting. What Buffalo Bill did in his Wild West show something that was perhaps more important than anything else he did in representing the West was he put that narrative of what we call the winning of the West, the conquest of the West. He put that adventure and that series of widely separated events into a narrative, an easily comprehended narrative. 2.5 hours, he told the story of the West, or at least he created a narrative that people could comprehend easily and internalize. So his story of the West, the winning of the West, in a way became America's story.
While cowboy games were a crowd pleaser, the real-life cowboy had a rather poor image and therefore hurt popular appeal of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Odd as it sounds today, Cody had to remake the cowboy's image into something more respectable. For the cowboy to become a symbol of the American experience required an act of moral surgery, wrote historian David Courtwright in his book, Violent Land. Such a public relations campaign was sorely needed. The Butte, Montana News noted in summer of 1899, "A great many people are afraid to come out to the bounding West and invest in our rich and varied resources on account of the cowboy."
The cowboy became a figure of chivalry, and as a figure who was more than just a stock herder, the cowboy became a rescuer of damsels in distress, and he adopted the uniform of chivalry, all of those things that we associate with the cowboy, the chaps and the boots and the spurs and the gun belts and vests and broad-brimmed hats and brightly colored scarves. And all of that uniform became codified during the 1880s in Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Well, along with that went a reappraisal of the cowboy in fiction. The cowboy became a knight on horseback. In the 1880s, it was still possible for President Harrison to refer to cowboys in the plains as gangsters. But by the end of that decade, and certainly by the 1890s, the cowboy was such a romantic figure that cowboys began even attempting to live up to their own image.
In 1885, the first woman performed with Buffalo Bill. Her name was Annie Oakley. Until then, there had been no women in the show. Now, for the first time, a strong, self-reliant woman was presented to the audience.
The first women in the show, beginning with Annie Oakley, were certainly not cowgirls. Annie Oakley was from the woods of Ohio, but within a very few years of the introduction of women riders in the show, they were being introduced as daring horsewomen, just like cowboys, and they rode astride. That is, they rode cowboy saddles, just like the cowboys did. And eventually they rode bucking broncs, and they did those same kinds of cowboy fun tricks that the cowboys would do. And they were paid equally with their male counterparts. So putting them in the arena to appear as the equal of cowboys was the biggest contribution Buffalo Bill made to the image of American women in the West.
Thinking of the days gone by, said he, dearie, don't be weary, you were always bright and cheery, but a tear dims your eye. Said she, they're tears of gladness, Silas, they're not tears of sadness, it is 50 years today since we were wed. Then the old man's dim eye brightened, and his stern old heart it lightened, as he turned to her and said, put on your old gray bonnet with a blue ribbon on it while I hitch old Job into the shade.
Cheyenne, Wyoming was one of the first towns to capitalize on the success of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and others like it. With Cheyenne still smarting from the demise of the big cattle industry and a series of recessions that started in 1893, a traveling passenger agent, Frederick Angier, for the Union Pacific Railroad, came to Colonel Slack, editor of the Cheyenne Sun-Leader newspaper, with the idea of creating a festival that combined cowboy sports and a little bit of Buffalo Bill-style drama. Together, they created the first Frontier Days in 1897 to bring the tourist dollars by celebrating the Old West.
The traveling passenger agent came to town, and he had already been to Greeley, Colorado, where he had had a very successful potato day, and he had been to Loveland, where he had a corn feast. They still have both of those.
With the help of the Union Pacific Railroad, Frontier Days succeeded in bringing thousands of tourists north from Denver to see what the real West was like. On Thursday, September 23, 1897, at 12 noon, the soldiers at Fort D.A. Russell fired their cannons, church bells chimed, and steam whistles blew to signify the opening of the first Cheyenne Frontier Days. Thousands of visitors made the journey to Cheyenne to see a celebration of the Old West. The first Frontier Days was such a success that the planning committee expanded the next year's festival to 2 days. The successful format of Frontier Days helped set in motion the beginnings of a new sport, professional rodeo. While the rodeo had its roots firmly established in actual cattle ranch chores, it evolved over time to suit the tastes of urban audiences and their need for exciting and fast-paced performances.
Because there are more people with more money and more leisure time, you have people who take advantage of the opportunity. And this is really when you start to see spectator sports, spectator events. And rodeo becomes very popular because it's something that is a reenactment of the West, and people can go and they can see the cowboys and the Indians, and they can see how the West was won.
In 1905, several of Kaepernick's Cheyenne rodeo friends and a young rancher, Len Sherwin, joined together to form a Wild West show. Just as the famous Buffalo Bill 23 years earlier, the group kicked off with a 4th of July show in Sterling, Colorado. The show featured daring feats of horsemanship and the wildest horses and the best riders, including the now champion Lady Rough Rider of the world, Bertha Kaepernick. The group performed as far as Lincoln, Nebraska, before they ran out of money from a string of bad luck and bad weather. The show closed. Later that summer, Kaepernick made a second appearance at Cheyenne Frontier Days, where she gave an exhibition of bronc riding instead of entering the bucking and pitching contest. She was introduced to the audience as Bertha Kaepernick, champion woman bronco buster of the world. As the crowd watched in anticipation, she mounted a white horse named Tombstone. And within a few seconds, she was forced to grab the reins with both hands. However, the crazed horse kept bucking until Bertha was thrown over the animal's head. Uninjured, she remounted Tombstone, but the horse refused to buck again.
Oh, yes, I get thrown sometimes, and pretty hard. But I always make it a rule to climb right on any horse that gets me out of the saddle. It keeps up my own nerve, besides letting the horse know that I am not beaten.
As Kaepernick understood, it was hard to earn a living appearing in county fairs and the few rodeos that existed at the time.
In 1906, she went to work for Pawnee Bill's Wild West show, and they went back into the East as far as New York with the show. She worked for them 1 year. Then in 1907, she went to work for the 101 show out of Oklahoma, and that's where she met her husband, Dell. And they had a lot of good experiences. They worked their way back east and up into Canada, and they were at the 101 Exposition in Jamestown.
While traveling the country with Bill Pickett, who had performed his bulldogging exhibition in Cheyenne, Bertha became close with Rose Wenger, a performer from her hometown of Cleveland, Ohio. Bertha also became very close to Dell Blancett, a cowboy performer in the show. Born in Guthrie, Iowa, in January of 1883, Dell had a very similar background to Bertha's. When Dell was just a young boy, his parents decided to leave Iowa and try their hands at homesteading in Washington state. His family began farming on 160 acres of land near Sutton, Washington, about 100 miles north of Walla Walla, and later relocated to Los Angeles County, California, where they continued to farm. In 1909, Bertha married Dell at the Wayne County Courthouse in Detroit, Michigan.
Was married in this building August 9th, 1909. Have left the show. Letter will tell you all. Ever your sister, Mrs. Bertha Blancett.
After getting married, the two headed back west to Dell's former home state of Washington, where they tried to make a living.
Walla Walla, Washington, October 3rd, 1909. Dear Sis, we'll drop you a card and let you know that we are all okay and at the Walla Walla Fair. Dell is riding in the relay race, won at the Spokane Fair. Your loving sister, Mrs. Dale Blancett. P.S. This is Dell on a bucking horse bareback.
Bertha and Dell spent the winter in Los Angeles with Dell's parents. There, the two worked for Bison Picture Company as extras performing stunt work. Bertha played a number of characters for the films, from an Indian girl to a homesteader's wife, and even a Western cowgirl.
I've been reading in the papers of a very funny land. It's the land where the women wear the trousers, where women is the boss and poor old man is second hand. In the land where the women wear the trousers, he's got to stop at home all day while she goes out to work. He's got to wash and bath the kids and mind he doesn't church. He wears a flannel apron when he's hustling off to work. In the land where the women wear the trousers, in the land where the women wear the trousers. Oh, what's a very funny town. No nice girls there walking round the place with golden hair and a pretty little face. They all wear corduroys instead of bits of lace. In the land where the women wear the trousers.
In 1909, the city of Pendleton, Oregon, a town along the Umatilla River, home of the famous Pendleton woolen mills, decided it too should put on a 4th of July festival.
Rather than focusing on having another 4th of July parade and make a big holiday of it, they would try to find something different. And so what they came upon was having a Frontier Day show. And that would distinguish them from the others. And so that's what they did. And in a very short period of time, you know, within the initial conception of having a big event that would draw in hopefully thousands of people to Pendleton, until they finally put it on, it was only 3 months. And it was spectacularly successful.
Pendleton's key to success, just as Cheyenne's, was being linked by the railroad. Pendleton was blessed by having both the Union Pacific and the Northern Pacific railroads serve the town. With the railroads, Pendleton could draw passengers from the city of Portland to the west and from Spokane to the north. While the Pendleton Roundup was an upstart, it would go on to play a number of pivotal roles in the history of rodeo cowgirls and invent an entirely new creation, the Rodeo Queen.
When you have a community celebration, you have a young woman, generally from the community, who represents the celebration.
Initially, the first queen was chosen very simply by the number of tickets she sold. Bertha Anger, a local shop clerk, became the Pendleton Roundup's first queen. However, Bertha had few ties to the community, and her family was not one of the prominent merchants, ranch owners, or community leaders.
Starting with the second roundup, the queens were selected by the decision of the board of directors for the roundup. It was a secret process. There are no records of how the women get selected. But generally speaking, the women would be the daughters of ranchers, local ranchers, or the daughters of someone who was instrumental in promoting the roundup.
The following year, 1911, the first year that Pendleton allowed women to compete in the roundup, Bertha Blancett and her husband Dell made an appearance after the rodeo offered the pair $350 to attend the rodeo for publicity purposes. Each year, the Pendleton Roundup continued to grow, and Bertha and Dell made it a point to return each year.
When I was a boy, my mother often said to me, "Get married, boy, and see how happy you will be." I have looked all over, but no girlie can I find who seems to be just like the little girl I have in mind. I will have to look around until the right one I have found. I want a girl just like the girl that married dear old Dad. She was a pearl and the only girl that Daddy ever had. A good old-fashioned girl with heart so true, one who loves nobody else but you. I want a girl just like the girl that married dear old Dad.
Bertha and Dell traveled north to the first Calgary Stampede. An unheard-of $20,000 in prize money was up for grabs, thanks to rodeo producer Guy Wiedeck. The Canadian Pacific Railroad also offered half-price tickets for passengers attending the performances. Over the course of the 6-day show, 120,000 spectators filled the stands. Despite the success of the Stampede, city officials were initially opposed to the idea of a rodeo, since the Day of the Cowboy was a thing of the past, now that wheat farming was far more important to the area than ranching. During the Stampede, a controversy arose over women riding with hobbled stirrups in the bucking bronc competition. While all Western riding saddles have stirrups that fall loosely beside the horse, someone discovered that by tying the stirrups together under the horse, a rider could stay connected to the saddle and horse much easier. However, this method was not without its risks. In a letter dated June 11, 1912, Stampede promoter Guy Wiedeck responded to a question from competitor Fanny Sperry Steele. "We allow lady contestants in the bucking horse event to hobble their stirrups if they so desire. It is needless for me to say that any lady riding the horse, slick and clean, will certainly be considered by the judges much better than those who hobble their stirrups."
Fanny Sperry Steele, who was the top woman rodeo star of that day, and she was competing against Goldie St. Clair in the finals. And Goldie was a hobble rider, and she was the crowd favorite because she really put on a show. But Fanny won because you got extra points for riding slick. And so the crowd really booed her. They didn't think she should have won. And it was the only time in her entire career that she was ever booed. I'm sure it was quite distracting. And Goldie St. Clair kind of just vanished from the scene, never to be heard of again.
Bertha, who always rode slick, won the relay race, took second place in trick riding, and third in both bronc riding and trick roping. She earned $1,150, more than any other cowgirl at the Stampede. During the winter, Bertha and Dell traveled to Australia to appear in Atkinson's Traveling Western Rodeo Show with some 60 other performers. Bertha sent a postcard to her sister from Hawaii, their first landfall in 6 days. Joining them on their voyage was Hoot Gibson, a Nebraska cowboy who had won the 1912 Pendleton all-around cowboy title.
Hello, sis. How are you these days? This was our first day on land since we have been out 6 days. Bertha and Dale.
The show after they got to Australia was kind of a flop. It wasn't accepted very well. So they had to work at a ranch to make enough money to come home. And they were in Australia for 9 months.
While Bertha, Dell, and Hoot were in Australia, 2 new faces appeared on the rodeo circuit that would have lasting impact on the sport: Bonnie McCarroll and Mabel Strickland. Bonnie McCarroll was born Mary Ellen Treadwell, the daughter of Daniel Treadwell and Alice Pinnegar. Mary was born September 23, 1892, in a log home on a 160-acre plot of land next to her grandfather's homestead in High Valley, Idaho, located 60 miles north of Boise, near the Payette River crossing of Smith's Ferry.
Like Lincoln, I was born in a cabin. When I visited the old home, it was with a sense of loss that I found all but one room fallen in desolate ruin. That room, however, happened to be the room in which I was born.
Mary's mother, Alice, was an accomplished cowgirl, from years of working on the ranch with her two sisters and younger brother. However, little is known about Mary's father, Daniel.
My mother, although never a professional rider, used to ride the range and break broncos with the best of them. When I was just a baby, she used to take me with her on horseback, carrying me in her arms. My training started then.
Alice, who eventually remarried in 1907, when Mary was 14, would take Mary to Boise for school during the winter, but returned to her grandfather's ranch every summer. Perhaps it was to her advantage that Mary straddled the two very different worlds of rural and urban Idaho. At her grandfather's ranch, she had the freedom to ride a horse and experience life working on the isolated ranch, while in Boise, Mary learned to live and interact with the people in her neighborhood and school.
By the time I was 14, I could sit most broke-in horses. I wanted to try my luck on a young bronco. After much teasing, my father gave in and ordered the boys to bring a bronco around. I mounted, the boys let go, and the bronco began to behave like a wild cat. I held for about 5 seconds, and then all at once I seemed to grow wings. Up I soared and turned a somersault, and the earth seemed about 10 miles below. Then I went to sleep and woke up in bed.
Despite her first experience on the back of a wild bronc, she was in love with horses and continued to improve. In high school, Mary took swimming lessons and became a competitive swimmer. On a summer afternoon in July of 1910 in Boise, 17-year-old Mary and her friend Margaret were watching Mary's brother Isaac as he was wading in the Boise River when another group of boys began screaming. One of them had jumped into the river further upstream, and since he could not swim, the current was taking him, flailing downstream. The other boys started after him, but hesitated, fearing that they too might be pulled under. As the boy disappeared into the swift current, Mary ran along the bank and dove in right where his lifeless body appeared before sinking to the bottom of the channel. She dived straight down and caught the boy, clutching the back of his clothing, and brought him to the surface, wrote the Idaho Statesman. For days later, the Boise paper was filled with letters of admiration for Mary's heroism. In March of 1888, William and Viola DeLong got off the train from Ohio at the station in Wallula, Washington, with their 4-year-old daughter, Orpha, and 2-year-old son, Earl. The DeLong family moved 2,300 miles to make a new home in the wild and woolly West, based entirely on an advertising pamphlet from the Northern Pacific Railroad. After homesteading a 160-acre parcel of land where the Walla Walla River meets the Columbia, Viola gave birth to 3 more daughters, Zella, Clara, and Mabel, the youngest, who was born February 11, 1895. Wallula, which was the division point for a number of railroads and steamship lines, was a natural starting point for men trying to seek their fortunes in the gold fields of Idaho. However, the town, with 6 saloons and a gang of gamblers, often relieved them of a large portion of their funds soon after they arrived. Mabel's father worked as a farmer, a shopkeeper, a shoemaker, and even a boat builder. He was active in the community and served as the director of the school district, and later he would become mayor of the town of Wallula in 1916. Like so many of the rodeo cowgirls, Mabel spent her childhood riding horses. As she put it, she had been riding ever since I was old enough to get on a horse. The land beside the Walla Walla River was horse country, and the county fairgrounds offered all types of horse racing events. Mabel gravitated to the rodeo arena through her friendship with the Drumheller family. The Drumhellers were a well-known local family that had a large farm where they raised and boarded racing horses. Mabel met Alan Drumheller, who was her age, and the two became close friends. He introduced her to horse racing. In 1913, the Western Idaho State Fair staged the first annual Boise Stampede. The new rodeo, which started a week after the Pendleton Roundup, would feature the best performers from Cheyenne Frontier Days and the Pendleton Roundup. Mary Treadwell and a friend were in the front seats of the grandstands watching the action of the Boise Stampede. Since there were only a few women competing in the bucking contest, Bertha Blancett stood out as the clear winner of the Cowgirls Bucking Championship. But the audience arose en masse and protested the decision of the judges that gave Minnie Thompson third place in the contest. The judges explained to the crowd that Miss Thompson had used hobbled stirrups, while Bertha had not. The Idaho Statesman of September 18, 1913, explained the concern with hobbled stirrups.
Riding with hobbled stirrups is dangerous in case the animal should fall, as there is not chance to get out and away from the animal, and the rider is always seriously injured.
Bertha's old friends Hoot Gibson and Rose Wenger, who were recently married, also competed that afternoon. Perhaps it was the motorcycle race, the burro riding, or the potato race that followed, but the two were complaining that the program was dull. When
suddenly a steer came chasing out of the chute and went careening across the field with two men galloping after it. One man dived from the saddle to head off the steer and went through the motions of bulldogging it.
It was Mary's first sight of Frank McCarroll, who had just set the world record by bringing down a steer in 11.5 seconds. Frank McCarroll was not a typical rodeo cowboy. In Idaho, he was more famous for his skills as a boxer and a wrestler than in the rodeo arena. But those skills apparently crossed over to wrestling a 1,200-pound steer to the ground faster than anyone else. After the events at the Stampede, Mary and her friend went to the horse stalls to meet some of the performers. Mary asked if she could try her hand at riding a bucking horse. So the cowboys brought out Bearcat, a 4-year-old bucking horse, just as they had done the week before in Pendleton for an overconfident horseman from Chicago. Frank watched Mary settle atop Bearcat, thinking that she probably wouldn't be much good.
He bucked his best, not seeming to care it was my first experience. I managed to stay on top and put up a fairly good ride, so the boys told me, until he bucked against the barn and fell.
That ride on Bearcat made a lasting impression on both Mary and Frank, for the two started dating, and Mary began her new life as a rodeo performer. Perhaps it was Mary's influence, but after the Stampede, Frank told the newspapers that he was going to give up boxing definitely and for good, after his November 26th fight against Sunshine McClure. Well, almost for good. On Thursday, January 14th, Mary recited the poem, "Gee, It Must Be Tough to Be a Rich Man's Son," to close the evening moving pictures program at the Boise Auditorium, while that Saturday evening, Frank knocked out Sunshine McClure in the 6th round in what the Idaho Statesman called a slugfest. Mary Treadwell and Frank McCarroll were married in Boise on November 18, 1914, a little over a year after they first met. Soon thereafter, Mary adopted the stage name of Bonnie McCarroll. In the weeks leading up to the 1913 Pendleton Roundup, nearby Walla Walla held its own Frontier Days rodeo, so it too could attract the high-caliber rodeo stars that were headed to Pendleton. In her first public appearance, 18-year-old Mabel won the fancy riding event and placed second in the Cowgirls pony race.
Walla Walla Frontier Days would not have been a success without the participation of the several scores of cowgirls, several of whom displayed remarkable skill and daring. The local girls who assisted also surprised many of their friends, especially Miss Mabel DeLong, in taking first prize for fancy riding. Her work in front of the grandstands was great. The Walla Walla Union, September 28, 1913.
You said goodbye and everything is over now it seems, and all you left behind for me were dreams, just shattered dreams. For you were all I had, the only happiness I knew. You went away without a word. You proved your love untrue. You never meant the key.
In 1914, Walla Walla Frontier Days finally caught the attention of the West's best rodeo athletes who could arrive a week before the Pendleton Roundup. What had been a local rodeo the year before now gave Mabel a chance to compete against the top women on the rodeo circuit. Before the crowd of 20,000 spectators at the Walla Walla Frontier Days, Mabel took second in the Cowgirls pony race, beating the famous Bertha Blancett, who took third place. Mabel finished the Walla Walla Frontier Days by winning the Cowgirl Fancy Riding event for the second year in a row. It was amazing how far the 19-year-old had come to be riding against Bertha Blancett, one of the pioneers of women's rodeo.
Well, as I started doing my research, I couldn't help but run across her picture all the time. And I would see her in this event or that event, and here was a woman who was such a great cowgirl, but she was so beautiful, and she was so tiny and lithe. And I saw these different pictures of her, and I couldn't hardly believe that a woman that attractive and that tiny could be also a champion bronc rider or a champion relay racer.
It was at the Walla Walla Frontier Days that through her friendship with Alan Drumheller, Mabel met her future husband, 25-year-old Idaho bronc rider and steer roper Hugo Strickland, who was also competing in his first major rodeo. Hugo grew up in Bruno, Idaho, with 5 brothers and a sister. At one time or another, all of the men in the Strickland family worked for Miss Kitty Wilkins' Diamond Horse Ranch. Throughout the country, this young woman, who ruled her ranch with an iron fist, was known as the Equine Queen of Idaho and was famous for supplying horses to the U.S. and British cavalry.
When Hugo started riding for them, and along with his brothers, she was running that ranch full steam.
Since there were so many horses to break and get ready for shipping, a young cowboy who once worked for her said, "If a man weren't a good rider when he went to work for her, he was a good rider when he left." Even Buffalo Bill came looking to hire her cowboys for his Wild West show. Although Mabel did not perform at the following week's Pendleton Roundup, the 1914 Roundup marked a unique period in women's rodeo history. In Pendleton's early years, the women's competition had been a combination of exhibition and real competition. But beginning in 1913, the rodeo, under the direction of Sheriff Till Taylor, began offering only real contests for women.
Until now, the Cowgirls bucking contest has been more of an exhibition than anything else, as the management considered it inadvisable to throw the event open and permit any and all girls to ride, for fear that some overconfident cowgirls would get thrown higher than a kite and get all mussed up in the fall. But the Cowgirls just positively demand an open contest this year, and the management, which is composed of mere men, finally gave in. So all that is required of a cowgirl who wants to ride in that event this year is that she have a pair of spurs and a hat. The East Oregonian, September 24th, 1914.
Without realizing the consequences, the Pendleton Rodeo Committee had inadvertently opened the door for a cowgirl to potentially take the crown of all-around cowboy from the men. For Bertha and the rest of the cowgirls, this was a chance to truly display their talents. Points were awarded to the top 3 finishers in each of the rodeo events, and competitors did not have to compete in the same events. It came down to the wire between Bertha Blansett and an Oklahoma cowboy named Sam Garrett. But during the cowgirls' relay race, Bertha's horse jumped the fence, which cost her dearly. Bertha ended up with a total of 52 points. Sam Garrett had 55. Bertha had missed out on the title of all-around cowboy by just 4 points. Over the winter, the Pendleton Rodeo Committee decided to change the qualifications for winning the all-around title. They determined that a cowgirl could come in second place and win a set of custom spurs and bit, but only a cowboy could win the all-around championship of the world, gold and silver belt, presented by the Police Gazette and valued at $100.
I think the years 1909 to 1914 are sort of used as the standard of the best times for American agriculture.
Talk about the subway, talk about the rail, talk about the streetcar lines as well. But when you are living where the fields are green, you got to get home on the 5:15. You leave the office at 5 o'clock. You stop at the butcher's for a steak or a chop. You get the evening paper and a magazine, and you run like the dickens for the 5:15. Oh, the 5:15. Hear the whistle blowing, oh, the 5:15. You're in your song slow, oh, the 5:15. Down the track is going, bang goes the gate on the 5:15. Wife is home awaiting dinner in the pot. Dishes on the table and the fire red hot. Get the loving message on the telephone. You got to eat your baked potatoes all alone. Next train home is the 7:38. Hubby goes right over to the corner to wait. Meets the biggest crowd he has ever seen. 17 commuters missed the 5:15.
On September 7, 1915, Bonnie McCarroll made her professional debut when she competed at the Columbia River Interstate Fair in Vancouver, Washington. In front of overflowing, cheering crowds, the 23-year-old competed against veteran cowgirl Prairie Rose Henderson, taking a third-place finish in the ladies' bucking contests. Bonnie's new husband, Frank, took home first place in the steer bulldogging. 2 weeks later, Bonnie and Frank left the excitement of the fairgrounds and traveled east to the Pendleton Roundup. That roundup would mark the first time that Bertha, Bonnie, and Mabel would compete in the same rodeo. The air was filled with the sounds of hoofbeats, the loud shouts of Indian war whoops, and the roar of 9,000 voices as Pendleton opened the 1915 Roundup by turning loose dozens of bucking horses, steers, and donkeys into the rodeo arena. The East Oregonian described Bonnie's first ride at the Roundup.
Pretty Bonnie McCarroll was first up, and her mount was the vicious little Snake. Applause shook the grandstand when she kept her seat with one hand aloft from first to last jump. The East Oregonian, September 23, 1915.
However, on her second day at the roundup, Bonnie was given her initiation into the rough and tumble world of rodeo. Bonnie mounted the bucking horse Silver, and in short order was thrown into the air and onto the arena grounds. Though visibly shaken and bruised, she was not seriously injured. Photographer Walter Bowman's striking image of Bonnie being thrown from Silver is now considered one of the most famous cowgirl photographs.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry right away, no delay, go today. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to pine, to be proud her boys in line. Over there, over there. Send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming. The drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer. Send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over, over there, over there.
In the spring of 1917, as the United States was drawn into World War I, Bertha Kaepernick's husband, Del, enlisted in the cavalry. However, he failed the Army's physical examination. Undeterred, Del went north to Calgary, Canada, and on August 1, 1917, he enlisted in the Canadian Overseas Expeditionary Force. Much to Bertha's dismay, Del wrote in his military application that he was a rancher living in Calgary and that he was not married. In Del's absence, Bertha retired from the rodeo circuit and moved to Portland, Oregon, where she worked in a book printing shop until they could be reunited. But Bertha became frustrated and lonely, and in April of 1918, she filed for divorce. A few weeks later, she learned that Del had been killed in France on March 30th, 1918. Hugh Strickland filed his military draft application hoping to be called into the United States Cavalry Service, but he never went off to war. Hugh and Mabel were married on May 18, 1918. Mabel soon became pregnant, and the two stayed at his older brother Edward's ranch in Grassmere, Idaho. On April 1, 1919, Mabel gave birth to her daughter April in Mountain Home, Idaho. Later, the family moved to Fort Worth, Texas, where Mabel and Hugh could train during the off-season. Bonnie's husband, Frank McCarroll, did not serve in World War I. The two continued to compete on the rodeo circuit, and in 1919, Bonnie won the Cowgirls bucking contest at Cheyenne Frontier Days. But life was never the same for Bertha after Del's death. The two were close, having spent years traveling together and riding in countless rodeos.
I feel that Del had a very high impact on Bertha's life because they were so much alike. They both loved horses, and they loved the rodeo scene. They worked together very well, and they just seemed like a compatible pair. They just really worked together.
In 1922, Bertha became the first female trail guide at Yosemite National Park, guiding tenderfoot riders through the beautiful landscape. While touring Yosemite, a young Army colonel named Dwight D. Eisenhower complimented Bertha on her riding skills after watching her help a rider on an uncooperative horse.
Prohibition, that's the name. Prohibition drives me insane. I'm so thirsty, soon I'll die. I'm simply gonna evaporate, I'm just that dry. I wouldn't mind to live forever in a trench. If my daily thirst they'd only let me quench, but not with Bevo or ginger ale. I want real stuff by the pail. I've got the blues, I've got the blues, I've got the alcoholic blues. No more beer, my heart will cheer. Goodbye, whiskey, you used to make me pretty. So long, highball, so long, gin. Oh, tell me when you're coming back.
In the years following World War I, a number of changes began to take place that would all have some impact on the country, and also the rodeo.
The 1920s is a decade in which people are leaving the countryside and in which farm property is seriously devalued since there's an agricultural depression.
During the war, the American government encouraged farmers to plant more crops and raise more cattle. But now that the war was over, there was a continually growing surplus that was only aided by high-yield seeds, pesticides, and new farm machinery. Wheat prices continued to fall after the war, decreasing as much as 80% as the decade wore on. The cattle industry fared only slightly better, with Wyoming cattle prices falling by more than 50% in the 4 years after the war.
Farmers were encouraged to take out loans in order to expand their acreage. Once the war was over, the government stopped buying these commodities, and the price of these commodities fell down to the bottom. Dramatic deflation. And many of the banks called in the loans they had extended to these farmers. In the meanwhile, the U.S. government was forgiving some of the war loans it had extended to its British allies in World War I, and this infuriated large segments of the political community from rural America.
Every morning, every evening, ain't we got fun, huh? Not much money, oh, but honey, ain't we got fun, huh? The rent's unpaid, dear, we haven't a bus, but smiles were made here for people like us, yes. In the winter, in the summer, don't we have fun, huh? Times are bum and getting bummer, still we have fun. There's nothing surer, the rich get rich and the poor get children. In the meantime, in between time, ain't we got fun, huh? Summer, don't we have fun, huh? Times are bum and getting bummer, still we have fun.
Perhaps it was no coincidence that the year after women gained the right to vote, Margaret Gorman was crowned the first Miss America in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Miss Gorman bore a remarkable resemblance to Hollywood silent film star Mary Pickford. A number of divisions were appearing within the country. Just what was the role of a woman in society? Should she be a stay-at-home mother and homemaker? Should she be an equal to men? Or an entirely new woman who challenged traditional gender roles?
This debate begins, which I talk about quite a bit, that still really isn't resolved. You know, what happens to society if the women leave home?
The Hazards of Helen, a popular movie series starring Rodeo Cowgirl Helen Gibson, presented the rise of this new woman as an adventurous heroine who carried a gun, drove a car, and saved men from runaway trains. But the Hollywood spotlight didn't shine on women for too long. In the years before, during, and shortly after World War I, women had played a prominent role in the growing silent film industry. However, after the war, the movie industry expanded into high-budget film projects with both national and global distribution, in part due to the destruction of European competition in the war. Such high-budget films required funding from banks and investors. which tilted the dynamic in Hollywood to the more male-dominated world of banking and high finance. Within a few years, women were no longer playing the heroine as Helen Gibson had in The Hazards of Helen. After 119 episodes, it was Goodbye Helen and Hello Hoot.
Well, the movie industry really can't tell men and women how to behave, but what they do is they're capturing a lot of the uncertainties in the American public. And they're giving them, in a sense, reassurance of what a large percentage of the population wants to hear. They want to know that, that men are the strong ones, and then that women are they're going to protect women, and they want to know that women are going to be grateful for the men who come and take them under their wing. Yeah, people are influenced by what they see in the movies and how you behave. And if you go back in that, and try to put yourself back in that era as well, what are the influences people are getting? Other than family and church, there's maybe one cinema in town. The movie comes in, and unlike today, you can pay your 10 cents and sit there all day long and watch the same movie and over and over and over again. And so if the same themes are coming out, if the movie industry is putting out the same message about how men and women behave, that's going to become ingrained in the culture.
The Ku Klux Klan was one of many groups during this era that promoted a return to these Victorian gender roles, a world where women were to stay at home and are protected from the world of business and politics. After World War I, the Klan gained popularity and membership throughout the West. In the early 1920s, Wyoming, Oregon, and Washington State all had a large number of followers. While the movement was short-lived, it was a visible sign of powerful social forces that were enveloping the country.
Well, it would seem in a time period in which urban cosmopolitanism is so highlighted by the press, by the national magazines, certainly in the movies and in popular music, a certain defensiveness in response. No, we in rural America want to fashion traditional values and the traditional place. We don't accept the idea of liberated flappers going around acting as if they were men.
During the winter, Mabel refined her ability on a bucking horse, with coaching from Hugh at their ranch in Texas. The following year, she repeated the rodeo circuit, adding bronc riding to her repertoire. Her ability on a bucking bronc helped her outscore Oregon Cowgirl Lorena Trickey and win the 1922 title of Champion Woman Rider at Cheyenne Frontier Days. With her championship title, Mabel also won the coveted diamond-studded McAlpin Trophy, awarded to the top cowgirl by the McAlpin Hotel in New York City. In an ironic twist, the McAlpin Hotel also hosted the National Convention of Physical Education Professionals, who for years had been advocating that women should refrain from competitive sports and engage in only light exercise. The timing of Mabel's all-expense-paid trip to New York coincided with the first annual World Champion Cowboy Contest at Madison Square Garden, put on by promoter Tex Austin.
It was a time when they were really trying to sell rodeo. And during those 20s and 30s, they were trying to make it a sport that was known all over.
Tex Austin's was the first major rodeo to return to New York City since Guy Wiedeck produced the poorly attended 1916 New York Stampede. The rodeo was redesigned to be shorter and to move at a faster pace because organizers doubted that New Yorkers could sit through the day-long shows common in the West. Austin put up $50,000 in prize money, which was enough incentive for over 100 of the top cowboys and cowgirls to travel to New York City to compete. The New York Rodeo was an experiment in taking rodeo away from its traditional fan base, and it showed a deep divide between the urban East Coast and the West. At first, the 1922 rodeo received limited publicity, and the newspapers preferred to focus on animal rights protesters. Animal rights had gathered a lot of supporters during the Progressive era. Even the recently formed Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts pledged kindness to animals. So it may be no wonder that New York newspapers noted how the crowd cheered for the steers in the contests and not for the cowboys. However, the crowds thoroughly enjoyed the cowgirl fancy riders, who were given more applause than the wildest stunts by the daring cowboys.
They were exotic to Easterners. It's like Buffalo Bill's Wild West.
The following year, the New York Rodeo picked up even more publicity. It appeared that Tex Austin's rodeo would enjoy long-running success.
And they said there was nothing in their life like riding into Madison Square Garden.
The backdrop of the 1924 Pendleton Roundup was the return of Hoot Gibson to the arena to film his movie, Let Her Buck. Gibson, who made the transition from rodeo to acting, had appeared in dozens of Western films since winning the title of All-Around Cowboy at the 1912 Pendleton Roundup. Gibson was to play the starring role of a young cowboy who comes to Pendleton and wins the championship at the annual Roundup.
And this is, again, still during the time when the Pendleton directors weren't really sure, what their queen was, how they're going to pick their queen. And they were experimenting with a whole bunch of different things. But when Hoot came to town with his group, with his film crew and everything, and brought Josie, the leading lady, with him, it was just a no-brainer that Josie would get to be the queen for that year. And if you look at how Josie is represented during the entire Roundup, it's so different than any of the other girls who've been queen before. So here's Josie, who's glamorous and flirtatious, and her court isn't young local women. She has two actors, or two men, as her court. And so this is completely shocking.
It was against this Hollywood film backdrop that a number of cowgirls asked the Pendleton Rodeo Committee if they could enter against the men in the steer roping, bulldogging, and bronc riding contests, since they were already sharing the same rough stock as the men. And if they should win, wrote the Philadelphia Public Ledger, why shouldn't they be credited with points toward winning the Roosevelt Trophy and the Cowboy Championship? Introduced in 1923, the Roosevelt Trophy had fast become the most coveted of all rodeo awards. The trophy was awarded by the Roosevelt Hotel of New York City in memory of former President and cowboy Teddy Roosevelt and was presented to only the best cowboy. The committee's answer to the women was brief. The girls were barred from the men's contests. Pointing to the trophy itself, they showed where a silver lariat falls from the saddle of a silver horse, supported by a silver and gold globe. As the lariat coils around the globe, it forms the letters, World's Champion Cowboy. The argument was rather ironic, since Teddy Roosevelt had been an advocate of women's equality since his college days at Harvard in the 1880s. Since very few women competed in all of the events, it was very unlikely that any cowgirl would have won the all-around title. Still, the cowgirls wanted the rodeos to acknowledge women and their abilities.
Well, they wanted to compete with the men because they wanted to get the same compensation. You know, men were paid a lot more, if you notice, in any of the old-time programs. And they did not want it to look like it was a feminine activity. I think they wanted to keep it, when you come to the rodeo, the bronco riding, rough stock type of thing, they like that rough and tough reputation that it had. And I think they felt that if they let a demure woman come in, it would take away from the toughness of rodeo as we know it.
Monkey business down in Tennessee. My Lulu made me fall. I'm monkey after all. Monkey business, now I see it all. When she rolled her eyes, it was no surprise how she could tantalize. Monkey business, nothing else to do. Just sit and pollywoo like monkeys in the zoo. This baby sure did know her stuff. I said, I'm through, you play too rough. There's nothing to this monkey business down in Tennessee.
In 1925, a writer for Literary Digest went to Cheyenne Frontier Days to write a story about Mabel Strickland.
As the steer flashed across the whitewashed line and a starter's flag dropped, giving her signal to begin, she touched her cow pony with a spur and she was off. The tiny child, she seemed just this, spinning a rope and shaking out a small, well-formed loop as she roped, stilled that enormous crowd instantly. A cow bellowed somewhere, the dust spiraled along the ground, and Mabel bent low over her pony's neck, racing like the wind. Then a flash of hemp, a graceful curving strand, pure white in the westerning sun, and the steer was jerked high in the air and thrown full length to a perfect bust. When her time of 24 seconds was announced, it was seen that she had broken the world's record. The best hands I know say that her act will never be equaled. The Fort Russell Cavalry Band began playing Hail, Hail, the Gang's All Here. Only one blast could be heard before the roar of the crowds drowned out everything else. Cowgirls ran to congratulate her. Cowboys jammed 10 deep around her and slung facetious compliments at her by the bushel. Literary Digest, September 26, 1925.
Despite Mabel's good fortune in the rodeo arena, the conservative social and fundamentalist religious movement was visibly catching up with women's rodeo. A growing number of Americans were having serious problems with things like Hollywood's morality, automobiles, and now airplanes, modern music, the way men and women danced in the cities, and women in the workplace. On top of all that, the courts, after the Scopes trial, were now telling communities that the Bible did not have a place in their schools. All of this change was coming very fast, and it was only compounded by a depression in the rural farm communities. After World War I, American cities continued to grow and prosper. They represented the majority of the population, the cutting edge of technology, industry, and finance, and of course, women's liberation and equality. In the fall of 1925, the New Republic magazine featured an article called Flapper Jane. The article gave an insight into how young women from the cities viewed themselves.
That fact is that women today are shaken off the shreds and patches of their age-old servitude. Feminism has won a victory so nearly complete that we have even forgotten the fierce challenge which once inhered in the very word. Women have highly resolved that they are just as good as men and intend to be treated so. They don't mean to have any more unwanted children. They don't intend to be debarred from any profession or occupation which they choose to enter.
It was quite the opposite in the rural countryside. This economic pressure became a driving wedge, forcing a return to the past for rural communities, a return to traditional structures and gender roles as a way to resolve the current confrontation with modern life.
This resurgence of Victorian ideals is a defensive reaction to the dominance of urban cosmopolitanism, that we are supposed to be the moral founders of this country. You know, Thomas Jefferson said that if there ever was a chosen people, it's those who till the soil, and that we are the backbone of this nation. We feed and clothe this nation, and now we're being treated with disrespect, and the Federal Reserve treats us with disrespect. The National Cosmopolitan Press treats us as hicks and rubes. As Hiram Wesley Evans of the Ku Klux Klan said, they call us hicks and rubes and drivers of second-hand Fords. Well, we are, he said.
While the popularity of the cowgirl accompanied the rise of the new woman in the West, she was now required to straddle both sides of the line when it came to what was the proper place for a woman, with the tide shifting back to the traditional Victorian role of a woman.
And again, we're going back to these ideas of women's place is in the private sphere.
In September, Mabel and the rest of the cowgirls received a large photo spread in the souvenir edition of the East Oregonian. In an interview, Mabel explained that she was a traditional housewife who happened to be good at rodeo events.
Now here's the way it is with Hugh and me. He's a one-woman man, and well, I'm a one-man woman. My home is my heaven. I don't care for these highfalutin ideas for women. I don't care about mixing in politics. I don't want to learn how to be half a man. I know you think I'm a paradox, but I belong in the saddle, for I've been there since I was 3. I love the open, dogs, horses, a gun, the trees, and flowers. Rain on the roof or any weather is like music to me. Still, I love dresses and everything that goes with them. I can't tolerate the mannish woman any more than I can stand the womanish man. I don't chew, smoke, drink, or get on the front pages of New York, Chicago, or Washington newspapers.
Even while she's enjoying this very successful career as a rodeo performer, through her interviews, her audience gets to understand her as someone who's struggling with this and yet seems to be more of a conservative or traditionalist than a modern woman.
After Cheyenne, Mabel and the rest of the rodeo community left for Chicago for the premiere of the Chicago Rodeo. As had happened in New York and London, the first Chicago Rodeo was marred by protests. Here they came from the Anti-Rodeo League, a group of prominent women in Chicago society. Despite the protests, the rodeo was a financial success, boasting a total attendance larger than the World Series. The Chicago Rodeo went on to become an annual event. Mabel's 1925 record time in the steer roping exhibition and her successes as a bucking bronc champion earn her the honor of being the first woman ever to grace the cover of the Cheyenne Frontier Days program. For the cover, they chose a photo of Mabel sitting in perfect form aboard the bronc Stranger from her 1924 ride. At the 1926 Cheyenne Frontier Days, the Wyoming State Tribune noted how the cheers from the crowd raised the roof several inches in the girls' championship bucking contest. However, the newspaper failed to report the winners. In retrospect, Mabel's appearance on the cover of the souvenir program may have also marked the pinnacle of women's participation in the rodeo, even if Mabel and Hugh did not compete at Cheyenne that year. Upon arriving at Pendleton that same year, Mabel petitioned the Roundup Committee to allow her to compete with the men in the steer roping contest. The Rodeo Committee denied her request, saying she could perform her steer roping only as an exhibition. Mabel, just as Bertha, was in the awkward position of being good enough to compete with the men, but not permitted to do so publicly. The Pendleton Roundup Committee also informed the Cowgirls that the Cowgirls bucking competition had been eliminated in favor of daily exhibition rides. An editorial in the East Oregonian addressed the Roundup Committee's decision by explaining that because women now swim the English Channel and they can ride and rope about as well and as swiftly as can any man who ever walked, hence they do not require nor do they desire the same degree of attentiveness they received in the days when the Roundup was young. With women no longer truly competing inside the rodeo arena, the Roundup Committee could focus on correcting the poor animal rights image that had come to be associated with the rodeo.
The Roundup is a strenuous affair, but it is not, and it never has been a show that tolerates cruelty to animals. From the very start, the purpose has been to avoid anything of that nature, not merely because it would be wrong, but for the further reason it would not be good for showmanship. The East Oregonian, September 18, 1926.
It was completely different in the West than in the East. It was like two different sports. The country was split right up the middle, and most of the cowgirls decided either to stay in the West and race or go east and make the big money and the big headlines at Madison Square Garden and the Boston Garden and Chicago, Philadelphia. And there they were, bronc riding was a big event, and they were big stars. The Greeno sisters told me they couldn't even walk down the street in New York without being mobbed.
Several important events would take place in 1927 that would mark the beginning of the end for the Rodeo Cowgirl. Upon hearing reports of animal cruelty at rodeos, the Latham Foundation of San Francisco, which promoted the humane treatment of animals, began an investigation. Based on preliminary findings, the foundation quickly formed the California Anti-Rodeo Cruelty Association to publicize the sport's poor treatment of livestock and horses. In June of 1927, the foundation spent 5 days documenting and filming animal abuse at the Salinas Rodeo, a rodeo that was chaired by Maxwell McNutt, a prominent San Francisco attorney. The findings at the Salinas Rodeo only reinforced the need for an immediate and statewide call to action. McNutt may have been an enthusiastic supporter of rodeos, but his position in San Francisco society put him at direct odds with wealthy progressive women who were opposed to rodeo's poor treatment of animals, including Edith Latham. The Anti-Rodeo Cruelty Association enlisted the support of the PTA, the YMCA, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and humane societies to gather more than 90,000 signatures needed to place a constitutional amendment before the California voters. While the association gathered the needed signatures, the cowgirls in Cheyenne were dealing with a new set of problems. Although the Wyoming State Tribune had exclaimed that the women were the stellar attractions in the Cowgirls Bucking Championship, their final results were not printed. It came as no surprise that after the conclusion of the 1927 Cheyenne Frontier Days, the Rodeo Committee formally voted to eliminate women's bronc riding competition. Interestingly, when women competed outside of the rodeo arena, in the horse racing events, their results were always published prominently. The 1920s was a period of transition in the sport of rodeo. Time and time again, women proved they could be just as good as the men. But was this a proper role for women? And more importantly, what would it do to our society? In Pendleton, this struggle played out each September in real time between the Rodeo Cowgirls and the Rodeo Queens. Each year, the pendulum swung back and forth, depending on the mood of their community, as interpreted by the Rodeo Committee. However, the pendulum crossed the midpoint toward a more traditional view of women in 1927, when rodeo cowgirl Mabel Strickland was named Queen of the Pendleton Roundup. By capitalizing on Mabel's reputation as a strong rodeo performer and self-described traditional woman, Pendleton was sure that Queen Mabel would boost ticket sales to the Roundup. While her role as queen went off without a hitch, Mabel visibly injured her finger during her steer roping exhibition and was escorted from the arena by medical personnel. Her injury, while minor, only served to validate the belief that women should not be involved in the rodeo, and especially not the queen of the Roundup.
I think it's in 1925 where there's finally some sort of equilibrium, that the press for both the cowgirls and the queens seems about the same. So the cowgirls are being talked about in the press as feminine and lovely and gracious as the queens, and the queens are being described as athletic and talented and as good horsemen as the rodeo contestants. Right after that, you see the shift, and then they're starting to criticize the rodeo performers.
Officially entitled California Proposition 21, the measure would prohibit bulldogging, the use of spurs to make animals buck, or worrying and exciting any bull, steer, cow, calf, or any horned animal by any means whatsoever. Proposition 21 would effectively eliminate rodeos, circuses, and the use of livestock in motion pictures. California ranchers feared that it would prevent them from branding cattle or breaking wild horses. As part of their education campaign, the Anti-Rodeo Cruelty Association spent tens of thousands of dollars mailing 2.5 million copies of their literature to explain their case to schoolchildren, and in particular, women voters. A group of prominent stockmen, ranchers, and businessmen, and the Salinas, California Chamber of Commerce laid plans to defeat the measure. The group assembled the Rodeo Educational Association and hired a number of Hollywood actors to help inform the public about the merits of the sport. At the annual meeting of the Latham Foundation of Berkeley, California, Edith Latham, whose uncle was once the governor of California, presented a sworn affidavit by rancher and cowboy Edward Gillette in the June 12th edition of the Los Angeles Times.
I have witnessed in commercialized rodeos of the western states cruelties to animals not often perceived from the grandstands. In horse bucking events, there are different methods used to torture the animals to make them buck. One thing I could not forget in the bucking contest in one rodeo of eastern Oregon was the placing of a small chain across the horse's back, behind his withers under the saddle. When the rider mounted, the chain is forced deep into the flesh, causing great pain. Edward Gillette, June 8, 1928.
To the relief of Hollywood cowboys, ranch owners, and rodeo promoters throughout the state, Californians voted down the anti-rodeo measure. It had been a close call for the rodeo industry, but obviously there were still issues in the sport that had not been voluntarily eliminated. After the election, the Rodeo Educational Association developed into a new organization, the Rodeo Association of America, or RAA, which would become the governing body for the sport and standardize the rodeo. Maxwell McNutt was voted president of the new organization, while a number of his Salinas colleagues became officers. The only outlier was William Haas, chairman of Cheyenne Frontier Days. By 1930, all RAA-sanctioned rodeos had to follow published guidelines or be blacklisted. The RAA did not include any events for women. The American flag waved slowly through the smoky air as the band played the Star-Spangled Banner. As the song ended, the roar of cannons marked the opening of the 1929 Pendleton Roundup. The East Oregonian called it the greatest day in the history of the four-day roundup, as several thousand faithful fans flocked into the stands and bleachers despite the haze and smoke from a large forest fire. This year's roundup was a bit of a reunion as Bertha Blancett, one of Pendleton's most famous cowgirls, came out of retirement at the age of 46 to be honored as the Grand Marshal of the rodeo. The crowds in the stands let out a big cheer when she was introduced into the arena. Mabel Strickland, queen of the 1927 roundup, demonstrated her roping ability on opening day by taking down a steer in 36 seconds, which, according to the East Oregonian, was pretty good for a man, let alone a woman. After 14 years on the rodeo circuit, Bonnie McCarroll and her husband Frank planned to retire to their new home in Boise, Idaho, after one final rodeo.
I know that Bonnie McCarroll had built the house of her dreams, which turned out to be kind of a California mission-style Spanish house. And I know about that house because I grew up in it later. But she had built this house and apparently wanted to furnish it. She had decided to go one last time to the Pendleton Roundup to ride and win enough to furnish the house.
What was to follow would change the course of their lives and of women's rodeo forever. The pickup men led out Black Cat with Bonnie's saddle on its back and her stirrups hobbled. Hobbled stirrups were a new requirement for women competing in the Pendleton Rodeo.
But she was hired as a contract performer. And as a contract performer, you have to do what they want you to do. You don't have a choice. And she had no experience riding hobble because she never did. I never met one champion woman bronc rider that ever rode that way.
Bonnie mounted her ride, and when the bronc's blindfold was removed, her horse immediately fell over and then went into a forward somersault. Once all the way over, Black Cat did the instinctive thing. He leaped to his feet and continued his bucking, while Bonnie McCarroll, so obviously knocked out in that fall, hung head down, her body limp, and one left foot still caught in the stirrup. For 6 more horrible leaps and bucks, Black Cat's weight literally shook the ground, and at each leap, Bonnie's head banged on the earth with sickening repetition, until mercifully that boot came off, and she lay limp upon the ground. To the horror of thousands of spectators, Bonnie's limp body was lifted from the rodeo grounds and placed on a stretcher. She clung to life in Pendleton St. Anthony Hospital for 9 days before she died of pneumonia and complications from her injuries. She regained consciousness only once for a brief period and murmured a few words before she lapsed back into unconsciousness. Her husband, Frank, remained at her bedside until the very end. On September 30th, Bonnie McCarroll's death made the front page of Pendleton's East Oregonian, and the news of her death appeared in newspapers around the country. The skies were bright Wednesday afternoon, in strange contrast to the somber procession rolling through the streets of Boise, bearing the body of Bonnie McCarroll to her final resting place. At the gravesite, her husband Frank carefully laid Bonnie's pearly white cowboy hat, her riding boots and spurs upon the coffin, the same one she was wearing when she was fatally injured in the Pendleton arena. Reverend Burgess, who conducted the service, recalled how Bonnie was loved by all who came in contact with her. He spoke of her sweetness, charity, and her good sportsmanship. In reaction to this tragedy, the Pendleton Roundup Committee voted to ban women's bronc riding and rough stock events. Cheyenne Frontier Days and a number of Western rodeos followed suit.
As far as I can discern, some group wanted the RAA to include women's events in their program and make rules for the safety, which would have eliminated the hobble riding. But instead, they eliminated all women's events. They weren't on their list of what we would call sanctioned contests. So any rodeo that wanted the RAA stamp of approval could not include women's competition.
Although those early records of the RAA have never been located, its president, Maxwell McNutt's life, does offer some insight for the omission of events for cowgirls. Maxwell was born in San Francisco in 1874. His father was a prominent surgeon, and his mother was the daughter of San Francisco's mayor. He grew up in a large house with his 2 sisters and brother, with 3 servants that cared for the family. After he finished law school, he returned to San Francisco, where he and his wife raised a son and a daughter, with the help of a servant from Scotland. For his entire life, McNutt knew only the city life of the Victorian upper class, everything that the cowgirls escaped, growing up in the wide open West.
You know, as successful as she was and as famous as she was, her family and I had a struggle to get her into the halls of fame. She deserved to be there for everything she accomplished, but her death simply overshadowed it, and they wouldn't listen for many, many years. We finally did succeed.
Yes, we'd met Bertha in 1975 when she was introduced to the Hall of Fame here in Sterling, and she was 93 years old, and they were taking her and her saddle down to Oklahoma City to introduce her into the Cowboy Hall of Fame, and we kind of knew about her and what she'd done, but it just didn't really dawn on us that she was really the world champion saddle bronc rider for 3 different years, and that she'd had all these experiences.
Hurry up, Sandy. Pick it out. There, boy, Sandy.
In 1941, a young Margie Earlywine was fortunate enough to see some of the last remaining cowgirls at Cheyenne Frontier Days. The traditional ladies relay race was the only event left open for women to compete in, since horse racing did not fall under the RAA's rodeo guidelines.
In 1941, when I was 10 years old, they came to our school and asked if some of us would be ushers in the big grandstand they now had out there at the grounds, the Frontier Days grounds. And I didn't know what Frontier Days was about. I had heard about it, but I didn't know exactly what it was. And I thought, well, this might be an experience, so I volunteered to do that. A school bus picked us up and took us out there. Now, when I got there and was in the stands, I was totally amazed because, as I said, those women practiced on the tracks and all. You know, we got there early. And you see, my mother never even drove a car. She was always behind an apron and in the kitchen. And, you know, we just, I thought women just didn't do that type of thing. And all of a sudden, then the rodeo started. And one of the first events was the women's relay race. I couldn't believe it. The athletic ability of those women was just, I had never seen it. I'd never experienced that. women had always just been in church in their little white socks and, like I said, the apron and so forth. And here were these young women flying, and I continued on. Every year I was the first one to get on that bus to go to Frontier Days for years.
1946 was the last year of the ladies' relay race. Cheyenne did not offer competition for women again until 1971, when barrel racing was introduced.